Hi, my name is Ann Staley. I am a water conservation specialist with the City of Glendale in the Water Services Department, and today we're going to talk about watersheds. Watersheds are really important because they are defined as the land area that will drain water to a common point. Here in Glendale, we fall in the middle Gila River watershed, but on a much broader scale, Arizona is a part of the lower Colorado River Basin. So it's important to know what watershed you are in, because a lot of the land use practices that occur in your watershed have an effect on water quality. So here in Glendale, Arizona, our water comes from two different areas. Some of that water can come from underneath us in the form of groundwater, which you will learn about in another lesson. But most of our water that we use to drink comes from surface water or a renewable water supply. So here in Glendale, we have the ability to take advantage of water from the Colorado River, and that comes down to us here in Glendale through a canal system called the Central Arizona Project. And we can also take advantage of water from the Salt and Verde River watershed. And that also comes to us down here in Glendale in the form of another canal system that is managed by the Salt River Project. So these are really important critical areas of water, a water supply for us. And now we're kind of ready to talk about watersheds, why they're so important. So a watershed is an area of land that drains water to a common point. Watersheds are defined by their boundaries. And for example, we're going to say that this model is a representation of our watershed here in Glendale. And the watershed is defined by boundaries. So the high points in that watershed area represent the upper boundary of the watershed. This would be something like hills or mountains that create a portion of that boundary. Now, the lowest point in a watershed is usually a water body. So we're going to say, for example, with this watershed model that we have here, the common point or the low point on land in that watershed is going to be this lake right here. So here in Glendale, Arizona, while we have canals to bring us that river water to us here in the valley, that water doesn't just come through the canal system and it doesn't just appear in those rivers. Something has to happen on land in order for that water to get here. So how does it get here? Well, water reaches us here on land in the form of precipitation. So rain, snow, sleet, and hail, those are all forms of precipitation that occur in our watershed. And for example, here in Arizona, we actually rely on the accumulation of snow or snowfall that falls in the higher areas of elevation, like our mountains. And there are actually scientists that monitor or measure the amount of snowfall or snowpack that has accumulated on the land, because when this snow begins to melt in the springtime, when the temperatures increase, that can actually help provide an inflow of water to those rivers, which then are carried through canals to us here in the city. So snowpack, the amount of snow that falls in the mountains in the wintertime is really important, and we monitor the amount of snow that falls because it provides us with really good, provides us with fresh water. So here in the watershed, there are lots of different land use practices that occur. So we'll go through them. Obviously right here what we have already talked about is we have the high points of the watershed, which are our mountainous regions. These are where a lot of our forested areas are. This is where the snow will fall and accumulate. Some of our really small headwater streams, the very first bits of water bodies originate in these areas. And then as we continue to move into the lower half of the watershed, this is where a lot of land development is occurring. So this is an example of a factory with a parking lot area. And let's just say that this factory is producing a certain electronic or a good that we use in our everyday lives. This is an example over here, if we move further along the watershed, an example of a farm. Here in Glendale, we have farmland areas, farmers that are using those farms to grow crops. Farms, obviously, they're important, right? Because they produce the food that we need to eat. So a farmer may be growing crops, vegetables, fruits in those areas, and a farmer may also be raising livestock, things like cows, pigs, horses, sheep, goats. So this is an example of a certain land activity happening in our watershed, but then we also, if we go over here and move to this area where we see a lot of homes, this is a representation of where we live in the watershed. These are where our schools are located, our churches. This is where we live. These are where our neighborhoods are, so several homes. This represents like a residential area. And then this little building right here would represent our wastewater treatment plant. We'll talk about the importance of that in just a minute. But if we go into our neighborhoods, just like any other area of land, we are rapidly growing, and in our neighborhoods, we may also have building and construction or development occurring in those areas. And we do have golf courses here. So this little flag here just kind of represents a golf course area. So one of the other areas that we haven't talked about yet is the very lowest point in that watershed, and this is where the lake was. So here in Arizona, we don't have any natural lakes. We have man-made lakes. We call these reservoirs. And this demonstrates an example of one of those reservoirs. Reservoirs are created when a dam is constructed along a river. And these reservoirs are really critical. We would not have been able to grow here in the central Arizona Valley if not for the technology or the engineering and manpower behind constructing these reservoirs, because they provide us with a long-term water drinking supply. So they're really critical, they're really important to our drinking water supplies. So we've gone through and we've talked about all these different types of land use that are occurring in a watershed. And you know, wherever you go on land, you are always in a watershed. Water is always being drained from high points to low points on land.